The United Nations Security Council, the United Nations' own website says, is the responsibility of this council to maintain international peace and security. But the question is this: is it able to live up to its own expectations? Because take a look at this list on your screens. Now, these are the 5 members, permanent members of the UNSC. And on top of this list at this moment is Russia, a country that has invaded into its neighbor. Thousands have been killed, millions have been displaced. What has happened quite clearly is that large-scale war has visited Europe after 7 decades. Incidentally, as we speak, Russia holds the presidency of the UNSC as we speak. Next up, let's take a look at China, a country that is threatening Taiwan. It dangles the knife of a possible invasion pretty much at all times, and according to estimates, this is something that even the United States has been talking about, that China could potentially invade into Taiwan sometime this decade. Day in and day out, Beijing repeatedly violates airspace and also international water borders, and on top of everything, the government has been accused of systematic genocide of the Uyghur minority Muslims. And then there is the United States of America, a country that calls itself the leader of the free world. But it's also a country that has a history of meddling into the affairs of other nations, of causing coups pretty much wherever it wants. The United States of America invaded into Afghanistan. It also has been one of the key factors, the key drivers for the war, the grueling, bruising war that took place in Yemen. And also, what is interesting is that the United States is yet to find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, the false premise on basis of which the Americans unilaterally invaded into Iraq. So how exactly is the world expecting peace and security from these nations at the top? Now, the world has, of course, woken up and it is asking some pretty urgent questions. So if the P5, as they are called, if they're not able to maintain peace at the UNSC, then what is the relevance of the UNSC? And if UNSC intends to stay on being relevant in the 21st century, then should it not change? The International Monetary Fund has already said that Asia is the emerging tomorrow. So at a time when China and India are projected to probably comprise nearly about 50% of the global GDP in this coming century, why is India still not a part of the UNSC? In simple terms, 4 out of the 5 members have publicly approved India's permanent member status. The bone of contention, of course, is China. It is against India having a voice at the big table at the UNSC. And that's the thing with UNSC. If even one member were to refuse to give the green signal, then the bid is shelved immediately. This is the infamous veto power. The United States has used it against criticizing the many misdeeds of the State of Israel in Palestine. China has used the power to protect Myanmar in the Rohingya genocide, and Russia has vetoed a resolution condemning the annexation of regions in Ukraine, including Crimea. So we go back to the question that we started with. 7.5 decades after the establishment of the United Nations, isn't reforming the UNSC the most urgent thing for the United Nations itself, for it to stay relevant? The world order has changed, so should a body such as the United Nations and the UNSC represent a more practical picture rather than a reflection of the world order that existed at the end of the Second World War? All right, now to give us more perspective in terms of why is it that the United Nations Security Council and indeed the United Nations has not changed in the last so many years that we've been talking about this, we're being joined by Mr. Syed Akbaruddin. He's joining us live on this broadcast. He was a former Indian permanent representative at the United Nations. Sir, thank you very much indeed for taking time out and speaking to us here on WION. Now, the question that I want to ask you is a question that we've been asking for a very long time. The UNSC, with its 5 permanent members, seems to be caught in a bit of a time warp. Now, despite the changing realities, India is still not a part of the high table of the UNSC. What do you think has actually slowed down the process of reform at the United Nations Security Council?
First of all, Mohammed, thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to engage with you and through you to your audience. In international affairs, there are decades when nothing happens. And then there are weeks and decades happen. So it's not unusual that change happens very rapidly sometimes and at very slow pace at other times. Today, you raised this issue at a particularly important time because we are on the cusp of a very fundamental demographic transition. Never in 100 years, never in 200 years, never in more than 200 years has a country overtaken another country to become the largest populated agglomeration of mankind in one place. So you're right to raise this question at a time when we understand that change of a tectonic nature is happening. That said, we also need to acknowledge that sometimes diplomacy moves rather slowly and is left behind. So in the case of the United Nations, let's look at the very first paragraph of what the UN Charter says.
Right.
It starts by saying that they are acting on behalf of we the people. Now, we the people would mean all people of the world, yet
Right.
it's incongruous that 1/6 of mankind were the largest possible agglomeration of human beings banded together in a democratic framework are together and not represented or not represented on the high table, as you said, the Security Council. It's an incongruous situation. It also reflects that reform sometimes leaves institutions behind. And perhaps that's what's happening with the United Nations. If you don't keep in tune with tectonic demographic changes, it's normal that change moves ahead, institutions are left behind. Now, there are many, many reasons for this. Perhaps fundamental to this is that those who are charged with changing the status quo or required to be part of changing the status quo are not too keen to change the status quo. And that's what you mentioned, the P5. So unless you
Mr.
have
Akbaruddin,
all
I
of
think
them on board,
you've touched on the nub of this issue, because the fact is no one gives up power willingly or easily, and that's where the crux of the problem is, because there are 4 nations of the P5 who've said that they would support India becoming a part of the UNSC. The only one that has not supported India becoming a part of the UNSC is China. So the question that I want to ask you is this: with this being the case, where China will adamantly and for a long time that we can foresee will always block India's accession at the UNSC, do you think is there a way that India can perhaps work through this by cooperating with the other 4 nations?
So there are very many ways that you can find solutions to situations which otherwise you don't find you don't think that there are ways out. For example, in the UN Charter, there are provisions which says that you can do a charter review, which means that the charter can be reviewed. It does not require at the stage of the review support of every permanent member. It will require, once the review is done, a affirmative vote, which includes all those who are charter members, permanent members. But just let me give you one example and you will understand what I meant. The United Nations Security Council in the 60s expanded from 11 members to 15 members.
Right.
These were largely non-permanent members. But when the initial vote took place, none of the permanent members actually voted in favor of that. US and UK abstained, France and Russia voted against, and at that time, there was a different representative of China. It was the Republic of China who voted for, but is no longer a member.
Right.
Yet, the charter amendment took place. So, it is possible that even if you say no at a time, when pressure builds up, when there is need for change, when you realize otherwise the institution will just not work, you will either have a choice to continue with a useless institution or a workable institution. And
Absolutely.
that time is coming because India's time is also coming.
Absolutely. I think you've put it really, really well. So thank you very much indeed, Ambassador Akbaruddin, for joining us and getting us your insights. As you said, for decades nothing happens, but there are years, weeks where decades happen. And I think that moment is here. Because as we speak, it's difficult to, in fact, foresee as to how the United Nations Security Council can stay on being relevant without having, taking into account the emerging reality of the 21st century. Because at this moment, the UNSC as it exists clearly reflects the reality as it existed in the aftermath of the Second World War. So how does the world move forward from here? That, of course, is a question that the United Nations will have to answer. Because at the time that the UNSC, in fact, came into existence, its stated objective was to prevent wars, large-scale wars from breaking out. But what we have witnessed is this. Every time a major power, such as Russia or the United States, wants to go to war, it does unilaterally without taking any form of consultation at the United Nations or even taking the other members of the UNSC on board. When the Americans wanted to invade into Iraq and Afghanistan, they did it without getting support from the other big nations at the UNSC. When Russia wanted to invade into Ukraine, it did it in the teeth of opposition from the Americans. And what we are now looking with the expansion of the NATO military alliance is, some would say, it is in some ways a sort of an echo of what was happening in the initial decades of the 20th century, where the world was coming together in form of hostile military alliances. The NATO military alliance is now expanding. Russia is also has got into an alliance, and of course it has invaded into Ukraine. And on this broadcast, we're also being joined by Ambassador Dilip Sinha. He's joining us live on this broadcast from New Delhi. He's also a former permanent representative of India at the United Nations. Ambassador, thank you very much indeed for taking time out and speaking to us on WION on this very important moment that we're looking at in world history. Because what is clearly happening is this: the demographics of the world are changing, the power dynamics of the world are changing, and despite of that, an organization such as the United Nations Security Council has still not updated itself. The question that I want to ask you, Ambassador, is this: with India having played such a pivotal role and a significant role with respect to many of the peacekeeping missions of the United Nations around the world, why is it that the big five of the United Nations Security Council still are reluctant to acknowledge what India has done?
No, you mentioned that the world demography has changed and the world power equation has changed. Now, the world demography has certainly changed, but I'm not sure if the world's power equation has actually changed. The world's top 5 military powers are still the permanent 5, and their share of defense expenditure in the world and their share of military power remains about the same as it was 70 years ago when the UN was formed. So the UN, at least the Security Council, has always been a body where power was respected. It was all about power politics. Mm-hmm. The UN itself was formed as a military alliance, right, and the permanent 5 were chosen for their military power. Absolutely. And for their ability to enforce peace. Now, peacekeeping operations have really been an aberration in the UN. Of the permanent 5, only China is a significant contributor to peacekeeping missions. The other 4 do not contribute to the peacekeeping missions at all. India and other smaller military powers have actually been major contributors, like Pakistan, Ethiopia, Bangladesh, Nepal. Right. So although India stakes its claim as a major contributor to the peacekeeping missions for its claim to the Security Council for a permanent membership, but actually with the other powers, it doesn't cut any ice, because what they're looking for is military power and the ability to project military power not only in the region but outside the region. Now, India today is a regional power, but beyond the region, I don't think India has the capacity to project its military power. And until it can acquire that capacity, right, it will not be able to influence the permanent 5 in getting a permanent seat in the Security Council.
Absolutely, indeed. But, Ambassador, we are also talking about how, the world has changed. Also, the UNSC is in some ways, it represents an institution that is still, continuing from the middle of the 20th century. The fact is, the objective of the UNSC is to prevent large-scale wars from breaking out. But looking at the backdrop of what's happening with the Ukraine war, NATO has now expanded. Russia's position has now hardened on what NATO is effectively doing on its western frontiers. Military analysts have been talking about the war that is likely to come in East Asia, where China probably could invade into Taiwan. The UNSC does not figure in any of these big conflicts. Do you think, sir, that the UNSC has actually failed? Because when one of these big world powers wants to take on or get into a war, the P5 simply can't do anything.
The Security Council was not designed to take action against the Permanent Five because they were given the veto. The idea of the Security Council when it was conceived was that the Permanent Five would act together to maintain peace in the world, and if any country was threatened, the Permanent Five would together take action. But the Permanent Five got divided very early after the formation of the UN. The Cold War started, and the Security Council went into a limbo. It could not do anything. Later on, the peacekeeping idea came up through Dag Hammarskjöld and other Secretary General of the UN. And in a limited way, the UN started working as a peacekeeper.
All right.
It was only after the end of the Cold War that the Permanent Five could act in collusion with each other, could act together. But we know the history of those military actions authorized by the UN. So the Security Council has been working at the behest of the Permanent Five. And where they are the invaders, the Security Council is unable to act.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly the reality that we are living with. Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador Sinha, for joining us and getting us all those insights there.